Hi everyone, I'm Kath. Thanks for stopping by. You can usually find me over on Twitch. I'd like to take some time to discuss some fundamentals of what could be considered imbalance in the game, the struggle of any game design company to strike a satisfying balance between the historical accuracy and playability of a vehicle, and why I think that in spite of the criticism they have received and suggestions by some to the contrary, Gaijin is doing a pretty good job with that balance. There has always been great discussion over historical accuracy within War Thunder, but lately it seems to have taken a step further into the realms of nitpicking, with people diving headfirst into the ballistic properties of a given shell, almost going so far as to attack Gaijin for perceived failings, with no reverence to the effect that pure historical buffs or nerfs may have on the playability of vehicles or their contemporaries. It's important to remember that sometimes these deviations are directly related to the fun factor of the overall game environment. The differences in design philosophy of different nations' weapons of war is a fascinating topic, and it's not without its nuance. It would be terribly boring if everyone had exactly the same train of thought when it comes to designing their tanks and aircraft. However, only a certain amount of this deviation between nations is possibly included within the game, and broadly speaking, only so much of a vehicle's character can ever make the jump from reality into the game. There are also obviously hiccups that come from building games around vehicles going head to head with one another when historically that wasn't always their intended purpose. Churchill, for example, was designed initially under the assumption that the coming war in Europe would mirror the cratered and battered stalemate of the Great War. So while it is incredibly mobile over rough ground, it is neither speedy nor well armed. As with most early war designs, it suffered with teething problems, and the Churchill didn't really earn its stripes until the Second Battle of El Alamein, where 6 Mark III Churchills proved to be almost impenetrable to the German guns and impressed upon the War Office the value of the tank. It was the gun of the Churchill that disabled the turret ring of the famed Tiger 131 that now resides in Bovington, an incredibly valuable intelligence grab for Allied forces. That said, even in its later variants, its armament was not to the standard of many of its contemporaries. As it was to support slow infantry advances and not expected to go head to head with enemy tanks, when it is placed in this role, and solely this role, that is of tank-on-tank combat, within the confines of War Thunder, its reputation is less than stellar. Now, this isn't to say that the Churchill is bad in War Thunder per se, but some of the shining virtues of the vehicle are absent as a result of the game environment not necessarily catering to these virtues. For example, plentiful and large escape hatches lending themselves to high crew survivability, and high mobility allowing it to access many places that other tanks could only dream of, including neutral steering, almost unheard of in the beginnings of the war. When put into its intended role as infantry support with such a thick hide and its uncanny ability to climb places totally inaccessible for other tanks, it was certainly something for the German infantrymen to fear. As we can see, certain design elements that played a massive part in the performance, or lack thereof, of vehicles in reality cannot always be reasonably included within a game. Take early French vehicles, with the so-called 1.5-man turret, the radio operator passing shells up to the commander, who is also the gunner, who is also the loader. If we were to actually experience the overloaded battle tasks of said commander within a B1 Biz, many of the early war French vehicles also, or realistically many vehicles without a 3-man turret, it would be a woefully unpleasant experience. Picture the scene. To observe efficiently, you must stop any turret activity and sit on your hatch. To load, you must stop observing the target, and to traverse the turret, you must do neither. As we know, there is a certain amount of artistic license taken here that, logically speaking, gives the tank an unhistorical edge, but for the sake of the vehicle actually being playable and not rage-inducing, rather than bending reality to the point of absurdity for no good reason. The overall game experience itself can also lend itself to giving vehicles an unhistorical advantage. While the many stumblings of early T-34s are well known, I'd like to draw particular attention to vision. They have only a periscopic sight facing more or less forwards, 120 degrees, for the commander, who is also the gunner, the gunner's optic, 2 static vision blocks on either side of the turret, a standard driver's vision block in front, and the standard hull machine gun optic. By virtue of having a third-person camera, be it in arcade, realistic or sim, you are functionally having an invisible, invulnerable commander either turned out from the turret or hovering a given distance behind it, giving an incredibly enhanced visual ability from reality, especially when under fire, when the commander would rather universally get down into the turret. Of course, in the case of sim, the commander's camera is realistically placed, but it still doesn't account for his vulnerability. Something as fundamental as the game having a particular camera angle for simply playing it gives benefits that are wholly beyond the capability of the real application of these vehicles. Coupled with this, the instinctively instant driver response time with no kind of communication lends itself to a superhumanly coordinated crew, which could not be further from the truth in the case of the T-34 in particular. Commanders and drivers had to coordinate and understand one another in order to move the vehicle. Gearing mistakes can happen, and of course in some vehicles the crews don't even have intercom systems. This also reflects on things like the gunner overlaying when moving the turret onto a target, as well as the loader potentially loading the wrong shell or fumbling and taking more time than usual. Thus, we see that the line between historical accuracy and playability is already, and rightfully, blurred a significant amount of the time for the sake of playability. The battle rating system pits vehicles against one another based on somewhat comparable performance, rather than actual battlefield experience. Whilst I personally would like to see historical events pitting scores of Crusaders, Lees and so forth against a handful of Tigers and assorted support vehicles in a North African setting, for example, in reality it isn't fun to be playing as a Crusader getting slapped from well over a kilometre for very long. It isn't fun to be playing as an early war French vehicle, typically with no ability to communicate with your contemporaries, as radios weren't all that common, and being massively unflanked by overwhelmingly coordinated German forces. Historical asymmetrical combat is fun to an extent, but for so to speak day-to-day play, it's not a system with any sort of longevity or fun factor, as the vast majority of the time you're not going to be the tiger. You aren't going to be the top dog. Games, by their very nature, cannot hope to reflect all of these nuanced aspects of a vehicle and retain any semblance of consistent playability, and it's frankly ludicrous to expect them to. It's trivial to mention the engine and transmission failures of later German vehicles, such as the Panther or Elefant, brittleness and shattering of early Russian armour as they were rushed from factory to front, so on and so forth. But these things also play a part. Playability and full realism don't exactly go hand in hand, and it's important to take a step back occasionally and realise that using reality to argue against game balance may not always be the most defensible standpoint. The balance that has been struck, and continues to be struck as a work in progress by Gaijin, is from my reckoning rather decent. It manages to revere historical statistics and performance to a point that's still fun to play without being draining. It will, naturally, give certain vehicles a boosted performance than their real-life counterparts. It will equally sometimes put a round peg in a square hole, putting all kinds of vehicles in what necessarily has to be a narrow combat profile that may stretch what they were designed for, or force them into a situation that they historically were not capable of performing to the best of their ability in. To this point, the current state of irrealistic battles comes into play, where tactical and strategic bombers are flying into close-range fighter battles as individual aircraft rather than in formation. But I digress. This is potentially a topic for another video. It is very easy to take petty snipes at Gaijin over incredibly minor deviations in numbers on a board, but more difficult to understand that in a broader sense, this game is already wildly far from reality because it has to be, by its very nature as a game. Thanks for taking the time to hear my ramblings. I'd like to thank, in no particular order, Military History Visualised, The European Canadian, and Oxygen Thief for their input and advice with regards to forming and fleshing out my ideas on this. I would love to hear some feedback, as I may develop this idea further into some more videos in the future. If not, I'd also like to hear any feedback you may have. Cheers, and I'll see you on Twitch.